Welcome, and thank you so much for coming out today for this is, I was going to say it's our final closing program for the Big Read, but there is actually one more next week. But this is our official closing program for the Big Read. I forgot to turn my mic on. Okay, let's try that. There we go. Okay, let me start over. Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you so much for coming out. Those of you in the room, it's great to see you here on such a beautiful day outside. And those on Zoom, thank you so much for joining us. For those of you on Zoom, I would ask that you keep your microphones muted, please. And if you do have questions for our presenter, please put those in the chat box. And we will try to address those as we go along. In addition, this program is being recorded, and the recording will be available at the Poughkeepsie Public Library District website YouTube channel. And that'll be in a few days, next week. So even though we have brochures for a program that is largely finished, I would encourage you to still grab one if you don't have one, because there are easily a dozen recordings of presentations that happened throughout the Big Read that are available to you. So you might find something that you didn't have a chance to enjoy as it happened that you can later enjoy on the recordings. So please pick those up. There are a few copies of the books that are back there as well that are available, free, take them, enjoy. I hope you have had a chance to read Lab Girl by Hope Jahren. This is the book that we were focusing on for this year's Big Read, a beautiful memoir, and a book that intersperses her life story with fascinating botanical information, research, and background. It's helped us to focus this Big Read on trees, on the world around us in general. And it is an absolute delight for me to welcome Dr. Douglas Tallamy to our closing program as our closing speaker. He is a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. He's authored many research articles and has taught for 40 years at the University of Delaware. He is going to be speaking to us today from his home in Pennsylvania. We thought for a while he was going to come, but you just don't know with this whole COVID situation. So he's joining us from his home. A major focus of his research goal is to better understand the many ways that insects interact with plants and how these interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. So the interconnectedness of insects, plants, and animals. He's written several books. His most recent book is called Nature's Best Hope, which came out in February and is a New York Times bestseller. We do have Walter Efron with us today from Three Arts Books. He's got some copies of the book that you might be interested in looking at after our presentation. Doug signed some book plates for us, so you actually do get his autograph slapped inside a brand new copy of his book. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Doug and his presentation. Please join me in welcoming Doug Tallamy.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, and it's a beautiful day in Pennsylvania too. I want to talk to you today about what my idea of nature's best hope is. But before I do that, I want to revisit what happened last fall, not this fall, but a year ago. Pretty sure it was up in New York as well, but we had what we call an oak mast. All the red oaks got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. And I was rewarded. An insect started to chew its way out of that acorn, and it chewed and it squeezed out of its little hole, kind of looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy, finally plopped to the ground. Very dangerous time for this insect larva because it tastes good. Lots of things want to eat it. So it has to get to a safe place, and it keeps squirming until it wriggles itself below the ground, where it stretches in all directions and makes a chamber, and then converts to a pupa in that chamber. And then it stays there for 2 years. When it comes out, it's an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think they have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down here. And a female will chew a hole down into the center of the acorn and then turn around, lay an egg in it. The larva goes down. That's how the insect larva gets down into the acorn. You might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. And that's a good question. But the answer is that it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Well, that of course leaves a little hole in the acorn, and it's a true vacuum, and you know nature abhors a vacuum. So there are actually 3 species of ants in the genus Temnothorax that live inside of the vacated holes made by acorn weevils. And if they find a new hole, they get very excited because their old acorn is falling apart at this point. So they send the message to the old colony, and then they carry it. They carry all the larvae and the eggs. They get very busy. It takes them about 30 minutes to move into their new home. And after they do, they post a guard there to make sure nobody else comes in. And then they'll live there for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. Well, about this time, my wife says, "What is your point? What are you trying to tell us?" I'm trying to tell you that is just one of literally millions of specialized interactions that comprise nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and oaks. Jays all over the world are the primary dispersers of oak acorns that fly up to 2 miles from the parent tree. Then they tap the acorn below the surface of the ground. The idea is that they're going to go get it during the winter, but they only remember where about a quarter of what they buried where they are. Yeah. And it ends up that each jay plants about 3,000 oak trees every single year. And that's how oaks get around. You won't have pileated woodpeckers. You certainly won't have them breeding in your yard unless you have lots of carpenter ants, because that's what they rear their young on. And you're not going to have carpenter ants unless you have the large trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have this plant, Facilia, because that is the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. As a matter of fact, out of the 4,000 species of native bees that we have in North America, about a third of them are highly specialized like that. For example, there are 13 species of bees that can only reproduce on the pollen of perennial sunflowers. You're not going to have Baltimore checker spots unless you have white turtlehead. I could go on all day. I could go on all week talking about the different specialized relationships. But today, these relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. Teddy heard about it, so he went to the canyon, he looked out over the edge, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. The problem today, of course, is that we don't have the option of leaving most of the country as it was, because we changed it long ago. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And that's because we've logged the country repeatedly, we've tilled it, we've drained it, we've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland, which is 4.5 times the size of Texas. We've certainly paved it or otherwise developed it. We've straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers, and we've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents that are now running amok in our natural areas. In short, we have fragmented the natural world into tiny remnants of its former self. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated from other remnants to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that we all depend on. Now, you might wonder why we've done all those things. And I think the answer is that we thought our nest, planet Earth, was so so huge that we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing headlines like this, one after another. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? This, of course, is talking about global insect decline. North America has lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population gone. And the UN now says we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, possibly in the next 20 years. And I love the way they report it as if it's just one more headline. I mean, they might as well say we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years and then move on to the next story. This is not an option, folks. This is simply not an option. We have to make sure that doesn't happen. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, thus upon all of our houses, but that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. And it's a cure that's going to take small efforts from lots of people, but they will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return to this headline briefly. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, Edward O. Wilson, E.O. Wilson from Harvard, probably the most famous entomologist ever. He's still alive. He's 93 now, still writes a book a year. But he told us what it would mean if we were to lose the insects on planet Earth. And he did it in this paper way back in 1987 called The Little Things That Run the World. What he said was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. If insects were to disappear, so would most of the flowering plants. And if most of the flowering plants disappeared, that would change energy flow, drastically alter it through our terrestrial habitats, which would cause the collapse of the food webs that support our animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, our mammals, and even to a large extent, our freshwater fish. They would all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that right now recycle nutrients very, very quickly. All we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans would not survive any of those drastic changes. The good news is none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape to do it. Why is that? Well, let me just remind you that humans are a product of nature. We are totally dependent on healthy natural ecosystems. It's those ecosystems that produce what we call ecosystem services, the things that keep us alive. This is what plants give us. How about oxygen? They produce oxygen. They clean our water. They keep it on land much longer so it doesn't run to the salty sea where we can't use it. Enormously important ecosystem service today is carbon capture. Plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of harm's way, taking that carbon, building their tissues out of it, and then pumping the extra into the ground. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plants have put there. They build topsoil, they hold it in place, they prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, and many other things. What do animals do for plants? Well, they provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds, and again, many other things. So designing landscapes like this, landscapes that do not produce ecosystem services, is really not an option anymore. It never was a good option. But today with 7.8, 7.9 billion people on the planet, it's not an option at all. We need more ecosystem services now than ever before because there are more people demanding them. There were visionaries through the ages who recognized that we humans had an unhealthy relationship with the land that supports us. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said was the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, some of our indigenous groups were able to do that for quite some time, but our huge Western societies and great Asian societies are terrible at that. We overexploit the land in one place, spoil it for sure, then move to another place and do the same thing. And what Aldo recognizes is we're running out of places. So he came up with this idea. He had a dream that humans would actually develop a land ethic. He knew we had to use the earth. We had to farm it and lumber it and graze it and mine and do all those things. But he dreamt that we would learn how to do that gently. We would learn how to do it without destroying local ecosystems. And in the Sand County Almanac, that's what he called the land ethic. What he never talked about, and it's always surprised me a little bit, is developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist together, same place, same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, and it's still embedded in our own culture, that he didn't even recognize it as an option. Well, I'm going to argue this afternoon that living with nature not only is an option, it is the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, conservationists worked pretty much where people weren't. They wanted to save things before we spoil it. We have to turn that on its head now. We have to put nature back where people are, because that's pretty much every place. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. Where are we going to start? Well, let's go back to this piece of private property here. 85.6% of the U.S. east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we ignored conservation on private property, we would surely fail, because we'd only be dealing with 15% of the land. And that is not near. That's what creates those small isolated fragments that aren't doing the job. There also, though, are lots of places that we don't consider at all as potential centers for conservation. How about power and pipeline rights of ways? There's 21 million acres in those types of rights of ways. 3 more million acres in railroad rights of ways. 17 more in roadside rights of ways. Golf courses, 2 million acres. Airports, 3 million acres. The Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. These are very large places. Then we have all the areas where we live, both in rural places, suburbia, and our cities. Hundreds of millions of acres there. If you add all that up, and you can think of other places that could be on this list, that's 599 million acres. How big is that? Well, it's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, Montana, California, even throw Texas in there. So not having a place to do conservation is not the issue. We've got plenty of places we can do conservation. You know, conservation is probably the wrong word here. Conserving, you know, you're conserving something that still exists. I'm talking about putting nature back where we've already removed it. Restoration is even the wrong term, I have been told, because people said, well, you're not going to restore exactly what was there before we wrecked it. That's true. We're not. But that's not the goal. The goal is to reassemble the specialized relationships that are nature, at least many of them, to the point where you have functional ecosystems again. It may not be exactly what was there before we humans came along, but it still would be good enough to produce the ecosystem services that not just save us on this planet, but everything else, everything else. In order to do that, we have to start by using the species that other species depend on. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we need to start with the building blocks of nature. And one of the first things we have to do is create a food web. In other words, remember, plants are capturing energy from the sun and turning it into food. And that's the food that allows all the other animals on the planet to be here. But most animals don't eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants. And that something typically is insects, and most of the insects that animals are eating are caterpillars. It turns out that caterpillars transfer more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So imagine what would happen if we took caterpillars out of the system. Most of the energy would remain locked up in plants, and you would have no food webs. Let's use Carolina chickadee as an example. Got a lot of data on Carolina chickadee. They're, of course, very common birds that are feeders. If I looked at my feeder out my window right now, I bet I would see one eating seeds, but that is not what they need when they're reproducing, because their babies can't eat seeds. So they switch from seeds to insects, and if they're in a healthy environment, they will feed their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they're not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds are rearing their young on insects, and again, most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's actually a lot of data. This is one study that my recent graduate student, Ashley Kennedy, has finished. She had a citizen science project where she put out a call for pictures of birds carrying prey items to the nest from all over the country. And she got thousands of pictures. And from those pictures, she identified what was in the beaks, what the prey item was, for 20 common bird families in North America. The green bars represent the percentage of that nestling diet that was caterpillars. And in 16 of the 20 bird families, caterpillars dominated the nestling diet. So again, imagine what would happen if we took caterpillars out of the system. Most of our terrestrial birds would not be able to reproduce. So something special about caterpillars. What is it? There's actually several things special about caterpillars. And the first one is that they are soft prey items. Think of this guy as a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is cuticle, it's exoskeleton, it's undigestible. So birds don't want a lot of that. And then it's wrapped around a lot of good food. And because it's soft, you can stuff that caterpillar down the throat of your baby without fear of injuring it. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. Their beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. And some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but do you want to chase 200 aphids or eat one caterpillar? They're nutritious. They're very high in protein, very high in fat. Again, low percentage of chitin compared to many other types of insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and they often have a lot of sharp edges. And it turns out that caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate and you're a vertebrate and birds are vertebrates, and vertebrates cannot make their own carotenoids, yet carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. And that's why my wife Cindy makes sure that I eat my carrots to get my beta carotene, and I eat my tomatoes to get my lycopene, and whatever that is to get my lutein. You make sure I have all those things because they stimulate my immune system. And I cannot think of a better time to have a strong immune system. They're antioxidants. They run around our body and protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said, eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. They improve sperm vitality, improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about particularly male birds like this prothonotary warbler, who is bright yellow because he's had access to lots of luteins. And he takes those luteins, makes pigments out of them, and puts them in his feathers. And the brighter yellow he is, the more ladies he attracts. Where are they getting their carotenoids? They're getting them from the things they eat, but carotenoids are not equally distributed among bird prey items. These first two bars here are two types of caterpillars, and they have far more carotenoids than other types of insects and invertebrates. Here, the third bar is orthopteroids, things like crickets, grasshoppers, and katydids. Here are the adult caterpillars right here, the moths and butterflies themselves. Far fewer carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves. That's where the carotenoids come from. And here's the earthworm way over here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. Does this matter when birds are choosing their prey? Well, Ashley did another study where she took GoPro cameras and put them on the roofs of bluebird houses. And those cameras took a picture once every second. The idea was to get a picture of the bird as it brought a prey item into the nest. And many of the bluebirds would land on the box and pose, and they gave us very good pictures. Well, those cameras took a picture once every second. She had a lot of cameras, a lot of bluebird boxes, and she did it for 3 years. So she had well over 1 million pictures that she had to go through to find pictures good enough that she could use. And it turns out she got 7,628 pictures where she could identify the prey item. And she came up with a very nice relationship. The prey that was brought back the most often were caterpillars, and they have the highest amount of carotenoids. Then those orthopteroids, next highest, and then everybody else is nestled down here. So all of this suggests that caterpillars may not be optional parts of bird diets. It's looking like they are essential parts of bird diets. So let's just accept birds need caterpillars. The next question then is, how many caterpillars do they need? Is 1 or 2 enough? Well, that's a good question, but if we go back to chickadees and look at how many caterpillars it takes to make an entire clutch of chickadees, no, 1 or 2 is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest, depending on the number of chicks in the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars for another 24 days, but they're flying all around so nobody can count those. So you're talking about thousands and thousands of caterpillars to make one tiny bird that's 1/3 of an ounce. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you have to have those caterpillars in your yard. They forage about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we landscape in a way that does not make that many caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And when you have insect declines, it's really looking like that's one of the major causes of bird declines. That study that showed we had lost 3 billion birds in North America in the last 50 years from Rosenberg et al. They posted their data and we got to look at it, and we separated bird species into two groups: the ones that required insects at some point of their life history, and it usually was when they were reproducing, and the birds that don't require insects. Things like the finches and the doves that can actually reproduce on seeds. They actually gained population size, but the birds that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species over the last 50 years. So this doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly is suggestive that as we design landscapes that eliminate insects, we also eliminate our birds. So if that's true, then we need to start landscaping for caterpillars if we want any birds around. And there's many other things that eat caterpillars too, but let's just focus on those birds. And that, of course, is a different goal. We've never tried to make landscapes that create insects. We'd wanted landscapes that had no insects, dead landscapes, in other words. So how do we do that? Well, we add caterpillars to landscapes by adding the plants that makes them. That sounds easy enough. There is a catch though, and that is most plants don't make a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be careful about the plants we choose for our landscapes. Why is that? Well, it's because caterpillars are really fussy about which plants they eat. Monarch butterfly illustrates that really well. You can have your calorie pear and your burning bush and your barberry and your buckthorn and all the other things we put in our yards, and it's not going to help the monarch one bit. You need to have milkweeds. That's the only thing they're going to eat. So what we need to do is put the plants that the caterpillars have specialized on in our yards if we want those caterpillars. Let's pause for a second and talk about why insects have specialized on particular plants. Why do we have so many host plant specialists? The answer is that plants have made them that way because plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of those plants. They are too well protected chemically. And if you don't believe me, I don't know if you have any leaves left up there, but next spring when the leaves come out, go out and grab one and eat it. See if you like it. You're not going to like it because it's not. All plants protect themselves chemically. There's a reason it's hard to get our kids to eat their vegetables. They inherently know they're toxic. Yes, that's a joke. But this isn't a joke. Insects do eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. Every plant lineage that's out there protects itself in a different way, and insects cannot adapt to all of them. So they pick one or two plant lineages that are using a common cocktail of chemical defenses, and they develop the adaptations necessary to circumvent those defenses. They develop the enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, the behavioral adaptations and the life history adaptations that limit the exposure of those insects to those compounds. All those adaptations allow them to eat those plants without dying. But for those adaptations to happen, it takes a long period of evolutionary exposure to those plant lineages. It does not happen overnight. All I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to develop functional food webs, if we're trying to recreate natural systems in places where we've taken them away, we have to choose the plants that are going to support the caterpillars that allow us to do that. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how easy this actually is. Starting with my house. This is my house. I'm sitting in that window right now. I should say our house. My wife is here too. We are about 10 acres in Oxford, Pennsylvania. It was a farm that was broken up. It was an exhausted farm. It had been in farming since the late 1600s, about 300 years. And the last bit of farming they did was to mow it for hay, but it was so thoroughly invaded with invasive species from Asia, escapees from our garden like multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and all those things you know and love. So they mowed that and called that hay. Well, when we built our house, they of course stopped mowing, and what came back was this, all the rootstocks of the things they had been mowing. So the 10 acres was covered with what looked like Sleeping Beauty's castle here, just this tangle of Asian plants. That is my wife, Cindy. She's getting ready to get rid of all this stuff. So if you actually have a serious problem from invasive species, don't give up. You can do it. Just start at the corner and march that way, and it works. Well, so that's what Cindy was doing. What was I doing when she was working so hard? I was telling her that she was doing a great job, but I also was putting the plants back, and I was selfish about it. I chose plants that I hoped would attract caterpillars that I had never seen and wanted to take a picture of. And I started with the Canadian owlet. That's what the Canadian owlet caterpillar looks like, and that's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. But you're not going to have them unless you have meadow rue. It's a specialist on meadow rue, and we didn't have any meadow rue. It should be growing where we are, but remember our part of Pennsylvania was just thoroughly exhausted. Many of the plants that used to be here are totally gone. No meadow rue anywhere around us. So I got some seeds from somebody and planted them. And I was hoping that the Canadian owlet would come, but I didn't know that it would. I mean, maybe it had to call all the way from Canada. I didn't know. So I didn't check my meadow rue. It was growing nicely, but I didn't pay attention to it. Then after about a month and a half, I went out and looked at it. It was almost defoliated because so many Canadian owlets had found my meadow rue. Don't know where they came from, but now we have a healthy population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. We've added 2 species to our property. Same thing with the goldenrod stowaway. It's actually a misnomer, has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristoso. I did know where there were some Bidens about 14 miles away in a power line cut. So I went and got some seeds, planted them. They grew very nicely. It's a beautiful plant. It took about a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find them, but it did. And now we have a good population of both of those. So we've added 4 species now. I wanted the Hackberry Emperor because it's a butterfly that ought to be at our house. That's what it looks like. But as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry. We didn't have any hackberries, so I planted hackberry. It took 3 or 4 years for the butterfly to find our hackberry, but they finally did. I looked at one of my hackberry branches this June. There were 9 hackberry butterfly caterpillar on a single branch. So good population of those as well. Now we've added 6 species. I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, but along with it came many of the things that eat goldenrod. Things like the brown-hooded owlet, the Arsidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. There are 110 species of caterpillars that eat goldenrod. Here's one that has not made it to our house yet, goldenrod flower moth, and that's what its larvae look like. I don't know why it hasn't found our goldenrod yet, but so this is like anticipation. This is like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. One of these days, the goldenrod flower moth is going to find my goldenrod, and that'll be a great day. Same reason I planted Virginia creeper, because it's a great plant for attracting sphinx moths. You know, a lot of people don't like Virginia creeper, but it's a beautiful plant. It can climb your trees without pulling them down. It's very gentle on the trees, and it supports beautiful things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult. The lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, and many others. Wanted the zebra swallowtail because I think it's our prettiest swallowtail, but I was pushing it here because the nearest population of zebra swallowtails that I know about is about 26 miles south of us. We're at the northern limit. It's a pawpaw specialist. So we planted pawpaw and then we waited. I had no idea whether or not the butterfly would get up here. We had to wait. We had to wait 9 years, but they finally did. They found it, and now we've got both of those. In the meantime, the pawpaw sphinx came. I didn't know there was a pawpaw sphinx, and now we have that as well, and lots of pawpaws. Planted I planted elm because I wanted the double tooth prominent, and it's a specialist on elm. I wanted it just because it's a very cool looking caterpillar. So we planted American elm, got a number of them. Evening primrose moth. Again, it's a beautiful moth. I like beauty like anybody else. So we needed evening primrose. We planted that, and this is how they spend the day with their heads tucked down in the flowers. It's very cute. And planted lots of oaks. And these are just examples of the things that we planted at our house. But I want to focus on oaks because it's such a powerful plant. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York. I don't know if anybody recognizes it, but people argue about whether it is 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. It's enormous. But it reminds me, a lot of people think your oaks need to be enormous before they start to contribute to your property. I hear people say all the time, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. Well, unless you die before the next year, you will live long enough to enjoy it. And I can say that with confidence because I started from acorns. or 2-foot bare root whips. And right away, the things that use oak started to come to our property and then supported things that ate these guys, like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, the orange-headed epicalema, the red wash caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crowned bucolatrix, the white blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-lined panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species have come to the oaks that we have put in our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak. It's just popped its head above the leaf litter here, and here's a Crocus geometer standing on the ground eating the leaves anyway. So you don't have to wait a long time for your oaks start to contribute and to build the life systems around you. This is a picture of our house. I took it a few years ago from the same place I took that other picture. Just to illustrate, now we do have some lawn here. We're very traditional, but put the plants back. Not all the plants, still working on it. But I noticed right away when we put plants back that a lot of moth species started to come to our house. And finally, I said, 4 years ago, I'm going to start to take a picture of every species of moth that has colonized our new plantings. And I've been working on it. I am not done, and I haven't gotten to the butterflies yet, but I am now up to 1,023 species of moths that have colonized our 10 acres in Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the land area, we have 40% of all the moth species that occur in Pennsylvania. And each one of those species is a type of bird food. So we have recorded 59 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres, which is 38% of all the terrestrial birds that breed in Pennsylvania. This works, folks. You put the plants back and they will come. You know, 2 weeks ago, maybe it's 3 weeks ago now, time flies, we saw this headline. The World Wildlife Fund says that 2/3 of Earth's wildlife have vanished since 1970. All I can say is not at our house. Not at our house. I will wager that we have increased biodiversity at our house by more than 2/3. Now we've been here 20 years now, but it didn't take that long. They started to come back right away. So this is a message of hope. I mean, these headlines are so discouraging. It just makes you feel like you can't do anything, but you can. You can put it back on the piece of earth that you own and reverse these headlines. We can recreate the natural world. But I know what you're thinking. We have 10 acres and you just live in suburbia and it won't work in a smaller piece of property. Well, that's a good question. Will it work on a typical suburban lot? Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. I was there just before the virus broke out. And they live in a typical suburban neighborhood. Their neighbors all have huge lawns. The serious invasive plant there is bush honeysuckle. So the first thing they did is to get rid of their bush honeysuckle. They live on 0.6 acres, so about 18 times smaller land area than what Cindy and I have. Then they planted a lot of native plants and they put in a bubbler, a little water feature for the birds. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that use their yard. They are up to 149 bird species, 35 warbler species. Now, just to compare that, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. They've got almost all the warbler species in the country have stopped by their house on 0.6 acres. So yes, it works on smaller properties. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's yard in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, she lives right next to one of the runways at O'Hare Airport, right next to Kennedy Expressway. She has 1/10 of an acre, which is 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. And there's no connectivity with any natural space. She's just a little island. Well, she got rid of her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants, again, put in a water feature because the birds love that. And then she started to count her birds. She's up to 116 species of birds that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, you can go to Pam's house in Chicago and check it out. What about city centers, though? You know, 82% of us now live in cities. Well, way back in 2014, I was staring at this plant, Asclepias tuberosa, butterfly weed, which reminds me, we have a serious marketing issue with native plants. We call them weeds and then wonder why people don't plant them. So we're not going to call this butterfly weed anymore. We're going to call it Monarch's Delight. So I was staring at Monarch's Delight, and the first thing I saw were two species of leafcutter bee, megachilid bees. I know they're leafcutter bees because they collect the pollen on their tummy, not on their legs. They have very specific requirements. If you don't meet those requirements, you don't have any leafcutter bees. They need pollen, they need nectar, but they also need soft leaves, leaves like you find on red buds, because they snip out the edge of those leaves and roll them up into little tubes, stuff them full of pollen, and then stuff that tube in a crack or crevice, and that's how they reproduce. Well, there was a red bud growing right next to Monarch's Delight, and that explains why the megachilid bees were there. It also explains why bumblebees were there, because the redbud, of course, is one of the earliest flowering plants that we have. Remember, bumblebee colonies start with a queen. It's the queen that overwinters. She doesn't have any workers in the spring, so she's got to do all the work. She's got to do all the foraging and raise the first generation of kids to help her. So efficient foraging is important. If she doesn't have a lot to forage on, her colony will fail early on. Well, there was redbud there, so the bumblebees had succeeded. And then I saw a monarch. Actually, I saw two monarchs there on Monarch's Delight. Now, this was 2014. Remember, 2013 was the low point of the monarch population. Only 3.6% of them left compared to 1976. I had gone all of 2013 without seeing a single monarch. And here I was seeing two. Plus, it was June, and it's unusual for monarchs to get this far north by June. So that's very early. I was very encouraged that they were going to make a comeback. Why were they there? Well, there was Monarch's Delight. There was another species of milkweed as well. So they had nectar, but they also had their host plant. They could reproduce on it. Do you know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan. I was 30 feet above the taxis and more pavement. This, of course, was if you haven't been there, it's a renovated, elevated railroad. It had been abandoned for years. Somebody went up there and noticed that there were a lot of plants growing up there that had seeded in themselves. Most of them were native plants. So they decided to make it a tourist attraction, and it's an extremely successful one. This is a little bit of nature in Lower Manhattan, and millions of people visit it every year. This is Rick Dark. He was after me to go, and there's the Monarch's Delight, by the way, to go to the High Line and appreciate all these great plants. I'm not much of a city boy, and you know, I love the plants, but I really love what's on the plants, and I didn't think I was going to see anything. So I resisted, but finally he dragged me there, and I was totally wrong. I learned that if thoughtful native plantings, and the High Line's not 100% native, but it's mostly native, if that can bring life back to the middle of Manhattan, then we can succeed anywhere. Very encouraging message. But there are four things we need to consider if we really are going to succeed. And the first one is we got to shrink the lawn. We've got way too much lawn out there. We've got 40 million acres of lawn in the US, which is the size of New England, which is essentially a deadscape. It's a status symbol. We've got 40 million acres of a status symbol. And I understand why. It projects the notion that we're well off, that we're good citizens, we care for, we're following cultural norms, all those positive things. So I'm suggesting that we not get rid of lawn, but cut it in half, cut that area in half, and put good plants in the area that we take out. We're still going to manicure the lawn. We're still going to be good citizens. We're not going to be thrown out of our neighborhood. But if we cut the area of lawn in half, we're going to have 20 million acres that we can put towards conservation. And if we do that at home, we can create a new national park that we call Homegrown National Park. How big will Homegrown National Park be? It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. And there are wonderful benefits from bringing the natural world home right where you live. It allows you to either develop for the first time or redevelop a personal relationship with the natural world. I don't have time to go into all the medical benefits associated with doing that, but there are many. Very interesting research. But you get to do that at your own time and your own pace, whenever you just walk out the door. You can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park, millions of people. It's an ordeal. It's also free. There's no entrance fee. It's never closed, no matter what virus comes down the pike. no travel hassles, and you get to experience the natural world alone. I don't know how you're going to develop a personal relationship with the natural world unless you are alone. And this is really important for our kids. Richard Louv has been writing about our kids developing nature deficit disorder for years now because they're not exposed to the natural world. So he says we got to get our kids exposed. So what do? We put them on a bus, 30 kids in a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour and then they walk around for an hour. Teacher tells them not to touch anything. They get back on the bus and go home, and that's their exposure to the natural world. I am sure that's better than nothing. But what they've really been exposed to is 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. What they need to do is be able to go outside alone, no parental supervision, and discover what nature really is. Develop that personal relationship, fall in love with it. And they might even learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning that from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in Hawaii on a very small patch of nature. It's about 10 by 10 feet of grass and a hedge, but there are anoa lizards there. And she invented this game. This is how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground. First, you disguise yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards don't see you coming. And then you crawl very slowly towards the lizards. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But the object is you're going to sneak up on the lizards, catch them, then you put them in an aquarium, and you developed a relationship with them. And she's been doing that for quite a while now. I don't think she's going to do it the rest of her life, but I guarantee she will remember catching lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life. If you want to do more than catch lizards at home, or if you want your kids to, then get this book, Nancy Stranissy's Nature Play at Home. Lots of wonderful ideas of how to expose kids to the natural world. Okay, so we're going to shrink the lawn. What are we going to put in the areas we take out of lawn? We have to put plants, of course, but all plants are not equal, remember. We got to put the plants that are most powerful, and I'm calling them keystone plants. This is one of the most important things we've discovered in my lab in recent years, and that is that all native plants are not equal in their ability to support the caterpillars that drive our food webs. It turns out just 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food. Anywhere in the country, that's true. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food, which means 85% of the native plants aren't making very many caterpillars. So we got to focus on these guys, these keystone species. The question no longer is simply, are natives better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are. But I can pick a bunch of natives and make a landscape out of it that support very little. And of course, that's not my goal. The real question is whether we want ecologically productive plants in our landscapes. Is that better than benign plants or even ecologically destructive plants? There is a huge difference. When we plant those ornamentals that escape and become invasive species like burning bush, like barberry and all the things I mentioned earlier, that's biological pollution. That's not only is that poor earth stewardship, that's like releasing smallpox spores on your property. It's just not something we need to do. I get emails once in a while from people saying, don't you know that ginkgo biloba from Asia actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? And that makes them native, and then we can plant them and everything will be great. Well, yes, I did know that the ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago, but we can argue about whether they're native or not. But this isn't the metric anymore. It's not whether they're native or not. It's whether they're doing anything or not. I don't care if ginkgos grew on the moon 7 million years ago. They produce 0 species of caterpillars. If you're trying to rebuild a food web, ginkgo's not going to do it. It'll sit there, but it's not going to do it. What is going to do it? Well, oaks are the most powerful plants we can put in our landscapes in 84% of the counties of North America. 557 species of caterpillars supported in the mid-Atlantic states, and that includes New York. Over 900 species nationwide. There is no other plant genus that comes close to that. 900 species of bird food, folks. This is what makes birds. Here's an example of what keystone oaks do in our yard. Remember, I've taken pictures of 1,023 moth species so far. Out of that 1,023, 899 have known host plants. So there's a bunch I don't know what they eat, but out of the 899 I do know what they eat, 265 species use oaks. Now we have 69 genera of native woody plants on our property, only one of which is the oaks, quercus. And we have hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So oaks represent less than 1.5% of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of our total plant diversity. But they are supporting almost 30% of our moth species. Imagine what would happen to the diversity at our house if we took oaks out. That's what Keystone Plants do in your yard. How do you find out what a Keystone plant is for where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder on the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of woody plants and herbaceous plants will pop up for your county. This is just an example of what a typical list will look like. This is very close to what you would see in various counties in New York. And it doesn't stop here. I just stopped because I ran out of room. Notice I say native oaks, native cherries, native willows, native maples. I say that because you can go to the nursery. If you say, I want to buy a cherry, they'll sell you an Asian cherry. If you say, I want to buy a willow, they'll sell you a weeping willow from the Middle East. They may sell you a Chinese oak or an English oak, because that's what nurseries carry more than the natives. You have to specify. What happens if you get a non-native oak or a non-native cherry, for example? You might say, well, it's the same genus that we have here, and it is, but we've done that experiment. It reduces caterpillar use by 68%. So that you do lose when you get those non-natives. Here are your herbaceous plants. Top one in most counties is goldenrod, followed by our native asters, and then well, all the sunflowers are native, but you want to get you don't want the big, I mean, you can have the big ones that make seeds for the birds, but the perennial sunflowers are much better for the insects, and on down the line. Plus, these top three here are they're the top producing genera for supporting native bees. You have more specialists, got about 40 species of native bees on just those three genera. So if you don't have those in your yard, you've lost 40 species of native bees. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put those powerhouse plants back into the yard. And then we're going to kill all the insects that come to our yard with our security light. And that, of course, is not the goal. You know, after 100 years of wondering why insects go to lights, we still don't know, but they do, and they die from a lot of different causes. Exhaustion is a major one. The moths fly around and around and around until they simply drop. They bang into the light, die from collisions, get incinerated, die from dehydration. The bat comes and eats them. A lot of nocturnal insects are blinded by bright lights. Who knew? And then it messes up their daily activities. They're finding a mate and reproducing. Most of this research is coming out of Europe, but it really looks like light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines across the globe, which to me is really good news, because it is the easiest thing to turn around. Just turn off your lights. But I know what you're going to say. I can't turn off my light because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on your security light so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're gonna learn is that the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light. And if you have a mercury vapor bulb, they're the worst. And put in a yellow bulb that throws yellow wavelengths, because insects are far less attractive to yellow wavelengths. And the least attractive type of light is a yellow LED light. If we were to switch to yellow LED lights, we would overnight, we would save billions of insects in the summertime when they're around. We'd also save a lot of energy. I mean, this just seems like a no-brainer to me. Fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks within Chester County support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, and it spins a cocoon and hangs from the branches. Then it emerges as an adult and it does it all over again. Well, I wish everything did that, but they don't. 480 species, 94% of the species on oaks drop from the tree and wiggle themselves below the ground if the soil's got to be loose enough so they can spin a cocoon or transform into a pupa underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that is underneath the tree. The problem, of course, is we don't have any leaf litter under our tree, and we mow and compact our soil to the point where it's typically so hard caterpillars cannot get down underneath. So this becomes an ecological trap. The moths come in, lay their eggs, and the caterpillars develop and drop down and die. And the next generation is smaller, and the next generation is gone. I am sure that this is one of the major contributors to insect declines across the globe. But we're just starting to think about this. And of course, the cement landscape is even a worse option. I don't want to discourage trees in cities. I want to discourage the profligate use of cement as a default landscape. That's just laziness. And we know it destroys our watersheds. This is what most people do. They have a big lawn and they put the tree in the middle of it. And nobody's measured what the survivorship of caterpillars is in a situation like this. But I guarantee it's higher in a situation like this. We have a tree, then you have a layered landscape. So here it's a native azalea. You could have a dogwood over here, ferns, ground cover. The caterpillars drop down into a safe site. Plenty of leaves to spin a cocoon in. The soil's loose, they can get underground. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you, by the way, how you shrink the lawn. Build big beds around all your trees. The trees will love it. No more mowers banging into them, and the leaf litter will accumulate under here. These become safe sites for those caterpillars. Or this is where you can put in those ground covers like wild ginger or mayapple or native pachysandras or foam flowers, lots of things. They're all safe sites, and you've reduced the area that's in lawn. Another one of my grad students, former grad student, Desiree Naranjo, has come up with some very good news, and that is that there is room for compromise in our plant choices. And she came to that from her research with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., inside the Beltway. She was in typical suburban yards, and she measured chickadee reproduction in landscapes that had a lot of native plants in them and landscapes that were dominated by introduced plants, the typical ornamentals that we have. And right away, she found out that the landscapes dominated by introduced plants had 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, the amount of bird food was reduced by 75%. Those landscapes were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. There is a nest box up in each landscape, but the chickadees would come and look around, and somehow they knew there was not enough food there to raise chicks, and they wouldn't even try. If they did try, the nest contained 1.5 fewer eggs. Those nests were 29% more likely or less likely to survive, so 29% more likely to fail. They produced 1.2 fewer fledglings if they didn't fail, and it took them 1.5 days longer to do that. And you might say, those aren't tremendously different figures, but you put all that together, this is what you get in a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass in your landscape, from none to 100%. This is replacement rate. This dotted line is replacement rates, the rate at which the population has to make babies to replace the adults that die every year. If you reproduce at this rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you reproduce more babies than adults die, you have a growing population. But if you have fewer, you've got a shrinking population. And right here is where those lines overlap, which means as soon as you exceed 30% woody plant biomass, non-native, so you're up here in this range, you're going to have an unsustainable breeding bird population. And we've measured the amount of native plants in where I live, Southeast Pennsylvania, Northeast Maryland, and Pennsylvania. It's 82% of the plants in our landscapes are from Asia, non-native plants. So it's way over here, highly unsustainable landscapes. But this is still good news for two reasons. This is the first time that this has been measured for any bird anywhere. So if you doubt that your plant choice actually impacts things beyond the plants, take a look at this publication. It's in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. But here's that room for compromise that I talked about. You can have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass as non-native, and you won't destroy the breeding bird population. So you can have your ginkgo if you really want it. You can have no invasive plants. You're not allowed to do that because that's biological pollution. But you can have your boxwood. That's not going to move, or your crepe myrtle is not going to move. And they're beautiful plants. I understand that. But as long as most of the plant biomass in your yard is native, you can get away with it. Can native plants be used in formal designs? Of course they can. This is a design down in North Carolina. I'll have to get the full name for it. For this garden. It's a formal garden. What they're doing is replacing the traditional non-native plants with native plants. Here's Joe Pye. Notice I didn't call it Joe Pye weed. It's not a weed. And when they complete their transformation, they're going to send me another picture. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. And I guess that's okay because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a traditional suburban lot like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. It's neat. It's beautiful. The native bees will use it. If everybody did it, we would support our native bees much better than we're doing right now. You know, if you ask people why we need pollinators, they say because they pollinate our food, and they do pollinate some of our food. It's less than 30% like you hear, but that's not the issue. Because then it makes people think if you don't live near a farm, you don't need any pollinators. Pollinators are pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we would lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. Not an option. So where do we need pollinators? Every place where we need plants, which is every place. Certainly where we humans are living, we need pollinators every place, and that includes our yards. Here's a design by Drew Latham, much bigger space. Think of the amount of life that is here versus the amount of life that is here. 0 versus a lot. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can. And there are more and more, I'm discovering more and more programs. Some of them have been out there for a while. Like Minnesota has a cost sharing program to encourage homeowners to replace some or all of their lawn with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. They'll pay you to do that. Florida, there are parts of Florida that are actually paying homeowners to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in their front yards. If you have a burrowing owl, you get paid. I mean, this is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written. It should have been written with carrots, not sticks. So rather than punishing you if you have an endangered species in your property, you're going to get paid for it. Everybody would want one. Missouri had a bounty on calorie pears, one of the most invasive plants we can put in our yards. Bring in a calorie pear body or take a picture. I don't know how they did it. And you got a free tree replacement. And apparently Fayetteville, Arkansas has the same program. A water utility in San Antonio is giving people $100 coupons to replace thirsty plants with native water efficient xeric plants. And of course, there's all those lawn replace programs in the far west, California in particular, up to $2 per square foot rebate if you take out the thirsty lawn and put in appropriate xeric plantings. We made what I consider to be 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one is that we have assumed that nature's important. We like nature. Most of us like nature, but it's not essential. And that means when resources are short, when push comes to shove, nature always takes a back seat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus, and there was this wall-sized poster that said, "Save wildlife for future generations." And you know, this is how our society, the major concept of what conservation is. We are saving wildlife so that our kids can enjoy it in the future. I hear that all the time. And that's true. We do want to do that, but it's a lot more urgent than that. That suggests nature's there just for our entertainment. I mean, if that's true, they can just watch David Attenborough and they don't have to ever see a cheetah or anything else. We need to save wildlife so that we have future generations. Much more urgent than entertainment. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. I mentioned this earlier, but if we restrict our conservation efforts just to the areas where there aren't a lot of humans, we're condemning them to failure because those areas are too small and too isolated for it to work over the long haul. David Quammen has a superb analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. It's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And this is what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that language because it suggests that there are places on planet Earth that have no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides. So what we need to do is put the plants back in those areas between the habitat fragments that we have left. And we're not just going to build biological corridors that allow plants and animals to move back and forth, but still live in these places. We're going to make it so rich using those keystone plants that they can actually live here. But it means we're going to have to start to share spaces. We're going to have to live with nature. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship just to a few specialists, a few ecologists, a few conservation biologists. We did not see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet. And I have no idea why, because every human being on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't we all share a responsibility for good Earth stewardship? I have no idea. Stan Rushworth, the Cherokee elder, once said the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with these mindsets, you're taught them. We're really good at teaching this one. We have been terrible at teaching people about their obligation to keep planet Earth spinning. We need to improve. It doesn't mean that you have to save biodiversity for a living, although it's a good living, but you can save it where you live. I like this approach because it empowers each one of us. You know, right now, it is so easy to feel totally powerless. The Earth's problems are so huge, there's nothing one person can do. But not with this. Go out and plant that oak tree. Plant any one of the keystone plants in your yard, and you will immediately see life come and start to flourish around that single plant. Shrink your lawn, pull out your invasive species, put in a pollinator garden. If 85% of us, or if everybody did that on private property, we'd be 85% done. So each person becomes a very powerful cog in the future wheel of conservation. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for us. Don't think about the entire planet's problem. Just worry about your little piece of the earth. Your private property, that's the place to start. If you don't own property, let's say you live in a city, then volunteer for somebody who does. Volunteer for a land conservancy. They're desperate for volunteers to help manage all their land. Volunteer for your local park or preserve. So as property owners or volunteers, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate, and then ultimately our own fate. Now, I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Doug. Are there any, we'll have a few minutes for a couple of questions. Do we have any questions in the room before I look in the chat? I didn't see any in the chat. Yes, Diane?
Do I have to feel guilty about flushing stink bugs down the toilet?
Okay, Diane wants to know, does she need to feel guilty about flushing stink bugs down the toilet?
Well, in one sense, yes. Put them in the freezer instead. If you flush them down the toilet, you're wasting thousands of gallons of water. But you know, I say that we need insects, but I am not ever promoting non-native insects. They have the same problems that non-native plants have. They are here without their natural enemies. So that means they're out of whack. They're always going to cause problems. So, you know, we don't want gypsy moths. We don't want emerald ash borer. We don't want brown marmorated stink bug or hemlock woolly delgit or any of the other ones. So yes, you can wage war on them.
Somebody else, yes.
What about with oak trees, all the what do you call them, acorns, attract chipmunks, which Lyme disease, the ticks are on the chipmunk.
So is the question, what about acorns that attract chipmunks? Uh-oh, you're frozen. Can everybody hear me? Shake your heads, yes. Was that the question? Yes, they're going to attract chipmunks.
Oh dear.
Yes, they will. But you know, chipmunks and squirrels and other rodents are part of the diversity that should be in our yards. What we need to do is complete that, though. We need to have the hawks. We need to allow the black racers to eat those, and the black rat snakes to eat those chipmunks. We have to have balance so that you don't have too many chipmunks. But I understand what you're saying. You know, they can go crazy, and they do hurt your favorite plants. So it's a judgment call on your part. But I say that the smiley faces associated with oaks far outweigh the grumpy faces of having too many chipmunks. Plus, chipmunks are cute, aren't they? I say that because I don't have any. You know, our 300-year-old property here, the chipmunks were long gone, and they have not recolonized yet. I'll be happy when they do.
Someone else have a question in the room? Yes.
How does he suggest getting rid of non-native plants?
Okay.
Burn them?
Round up.
Okay, Doug, a short tutorial, Doug, on how to get rid of invasives.
Yeah, it's hard to do this in a short way. Well, the easiest way, so it depends on what they are.
How about
Woody
popcorn?
invasives are actually easier to get rid of than herbaceous things. So let's just start with woodies, like autumn olive or buckthorn or something like that. I cut them off at the base and I paint them with an herbicide. And the reason I do that is because when we moved in, we made a pact. We're not going to use any herbicides at all. And after several years of not killing anything, because you never kill the rootstock, and realizing we're going to do this the rest of our lives and then fail, I said, well, we will compromise and treat it like chemotherapy, and you just paint a little bit on and not spraying anything, getting it all over, so that you kill the roots and they can actually make progress. Now, this is an issue with my wife, Cindy. She won't touch this stuff. So she does the cutting and I do the painting, or she's happy to just cut it over and over and over again. And eventually you can exhaust the root stock, but you got to have a lot of patience to do that.
There was a question on Zoom about an invasive. How do you know it's an invasive?
Oh, well, you know, there's a lot of resources on the web. The easiest thing is if you know iNaturalist, you can take a picture of the leaf and send it in. You'll get an instant answer. Or you can send it to me. I'll give you an answer too. We don't have that many species of invasives. There are far more species of natives. But when you go to an area and you have a monoculture of something, be highly suspicious, because that's what invasives do. The big ones where you live, you know, it's burning bush, it's barberry. I don't know how big Callery pear is around you, but it's huge down where we are. Porcelain berries going crazy. Japanese knotweed along your waterways. When you see these monocultures, that's going to be an invasive.
All right, thank you. One more question in the room or on Zoom? Yes.
Well, if you want to plant, especially things like Joe Pye and some of these herbaceous things, where do you get them?
Okay. Where do we find things like Joe Pye and other herbaceous things that we want to plant?
Right. You know, I don't know the nurseries around you that are selling them, but more and more are. The native plant trade has exploded. It's going through the roof because everybody wants them. And so it's a business opportunity. More and more people are selling them. But ask the New York Native Plant Society where you can find these things. That tool that I told you about, Native Plant Finder on the National Wildlife Federation website, there is a plan that for every single county, the suppliers of these plants will also pop up. They haven't enacted that plan yet, but that'll be a great resource itself. So they're easier to find now than they used to be.
Great, well, that's good news. I was saying to Tom this past week that I think I'd like to buy a copy of Doug's book for each of the local big nurseries and invite them to a book discussion, you know, a month and a half later, just to kind of see what kind of conversation we can develop around this whole landscaping with natives kind of idea. But
sounds like a good idea to me.
We're going to wrap it up. One question in the back there.
It's not a question so much as a comment. Two of the places I find native plants are Adams, and there's a native plants nursery on 22 towards Fallen.
Ah, okay, 2 local places where you can find natives. All
And
right.
there's a good list of Native American plants at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation.
Right.
Great. All right. Well, we are going to let you go, Doug. We have a little bit more of our particular Doug Tallamy for joining us. Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. So we usually take this time at the end of our Big Read program to kind of recap what we did, and we have a few awards to celebrate, but we are really going to power through this because we also want to announce next year's book choice. So I'm going to make this really, really quick. We had a little contest. What we called the Family Nature Challenge, okay? And if you marked off that you did each of these and turned in your board, then you were entered into a drawing. So we have our prize winner here today, Eileen Weslowski. All right. Thank you, Eileen. And then we also invited book clubs to, Tom, could you take a picture of Eileen?
Maybe turn the light on?
Oh, there, maybe.
Now
we
you
should-
want the
No,
Something man-made.
we also invited book clubs to,
Jewel, stand by.
oh, all right. So Diane, can you come up and we're going to do our,
Okay.
thank you.
I want to show you, here's my little brown book I happened to pick up at one of the meetings with my foundations and my collections are in this little brown
Awesome,
book.
awesome. Well, there are more of those little journals in the back, and there are more of these if you want to just take one home and have some fun with it. So our book clubs that wanted to enter could then write up a review and send it to us. And so now we're going to pick our winner from our book clubs. So Diane, would you pick?
That one?
All right. And our winner for our book clubs is the SPAC Readers.
Oh.
And Bonnie is here representing SPAC Readers. Fantastic.
Yes, you do. You're masked. No, we don't know who you are. Thank you.
I want my leafiest shirt. Thank you.
From beginning.
There we go. All right, now, Tom, would you advance it for me because the clicker
Yes.
doesn't work once we're.
Just go beep. when
Yes,
you're-
all right, okay. Beep, go. We're gonna zip through this really fast. Okay. One of the most common questions is why we picked a particular book. Go on to the next one, please. Why Lab Girl? Well, the NEA gives us a book list. We got to pick something off the book list. So last year it was about 30 titles. We thought, oh, we've never done a memoir before. Oh, we've never done a book written by a female scientist, and we've not done a book written all about nature. So it seemed like a great choice. Here we find ourselves in 2020, valuing science or not, right? And connecting with nature because we're feeling isolated. Appreciating nature in new ways and assessing our mental health. For a lot of reasons, I think that this was an ideal book for where we ended up in 2020. Keep going. Along with the adult book, we do offer children's reading material that is similar in theme. So we had multiple books to choose from, and we had guest speakers. Judith Sumner is another author that came, as well as Doug Tallamy. Just a representation of the impact across all of our schools and community. Go ahead. This was a picture of our professional development, what it looked like in 2019. Obviously, we couldn't do that for our teachers this year. So what we did was we created virtual modules, and we had 66 teachers who took those virtual professional development modules to prepare them for using this Big Read literature in their classrooms. This is a quote from some of our Clinton Elementary 4th grade teachers about the virtual visit from author Sarah Bauman to their classrooms. She's been fantastic with the kids. We also have a great collaboration with BOCES, Salt Point Education Center, and Marist College Special Education Teacher Degree Program, where they take the Little Read book and they adapt it so that a child who maybe is 12 years old can read a book about 12-year-old kids, but it's adapted for their particular learning disabilities. And it's a fantastic collaboration that's been happening over several years now. They take the Little Read book and adapt it in the classrooms. There were creative connections through Marcia Fishman at, she's volunteering at Archduchess Dahab. And of course, they often create a diorama for us. This year, it didn't happen, but she did lots of other wonderful things with them. Go ahead. We also had community trees around the community. Go ahead. We also had a lovely, Grinnell Library has this fantastic tree in their children's department. Go ahead. This is Lauren Bell from Vassar Environmental Cooperative doing a hike. And we also have Joyce DeVries Tomaselli doing a tree identification project. We had great environmental partners this year. It was phenomenal, the support. Go ahead. We also had scholars from Vassar College who gave us great insight into what it was like to be a female in science, as well as doing great work in botany and landscape restoration. We also brought in experts from invasive species, citizen science kind of programs with invasive species, as well as some wonderful cooking and gardening programs. We had interesting presentation from an artist on pollinators, as well as the process she used on printmaking. We took a look at a fantastic photograph, a cyanograph made by a female botany photographer from the 1800s, Anna Atkins, that's located at the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center. We also heard about Poughkeepsie's trees from Natalie Quinn. The upcoming program this next week, organized by the AAUW, will be our final program of 2020. That's Renee Weissman talking about winning in a man's world. If you want to join that meeting, it's a Zoom meeting only, and you have to go to the AAUW, the Poughkeepsie branch website, and you can register so that you get the link for that Zoom meeting. We had great partners with the Art Effect. They created some fantastic art painting programs that were done virtually that worked out beautifully. There were also several programs put together by the FDR Presidential Library and Museum. We had a couple of memoir writing workshops with local author Sandy Sonnenfeld. We looked at composting, as well as some fantastic, earlier today we had a couple of fantastic woodworkers in talking about how they use wood to create beautiful musical instruments and artwork and so on. Speaking of art, we had art in all kinds of forms. We had the Philharmonic musicians create a beautiful program. If you want to watch that, that is still available through Bardavon Presents on their YouTube channel. You can watch that program. We had gnomes in the library. Indeed, that was exciting. And we had art, botanical photography by Elizabeth Panzer at Adrian's. And at the Boardman Road Friends Bookstore, we had beautiful Poughkeepsie Botanicals by Julia Whitney Barnes. We also traveled via Zoom to Harvard to take a insider's look at the glass models of plants. And we had kids doing leaf rubbings and bark rubbings and all kinds of fun stuff. But of course, it was all about the reading as well. We got a lot out of our Lab Girl memoir. I highly encourage you to read it. And we had book groups in person, book groups on Zoom, and book groups outdoors. We had one book group, the Griffin book group at Dan White, that actually even sent me a book, an electronic book with their responses, had recordings and all kinds of cool things. Very, very creative. We invested our time, our energy, and we were inspired. We broadened our understanding. And it was a community effort. So many thanks to Poughkeepsie Public Library Districts, to the NEA, to the community, and our volunteers, our sponsors, amazing collaborations, great environmental organizations, phenomenal volunteers, and very generous supporters that all work together to make this annual Big Read happen. Okay, we already did our book club winner, and we're on to what's next. Woo! Okay.
So I'm Tom Lawrence, and I'm director of the Poughkeepsie Public Library District, and it's my pleasure annually to announce next year's books. As Jewel mentioned earlier, the NEA had previously had a list of about 30 books from which we could choose, and we've done 10 or 11 of them. We're that far into the Big Read. We were warned early on this that there was going to be a major change, and there was a major change. There was an assumption that they were going to be working and revising the list of available books to coincide with the national preparation for, and it's only 5 years from now, the 250th celebration of signing the Declaration of Independence. So my mind was going all over the place, and nowhere the NEA was going. When they announced their list, it was a total of six books, one including The Grapes of Wrath, which we've already done, the latest book by Jo Harjo, who we did 2 or 3 years ago with her Native American poetry and prose, Beloved by Toni Morrison. And one of the things that we've noticed about these books is that they tend to be a little bit depressing, a little heavy. So then we were left with what we thought were other possibilities. One was The House on Mango Street, which is a very popular book by Susan Cisneros, Sandy Cisneros, and it's definitely a older middle school age book. Then we had The Call of the Wild, which I was initially drawn to, and nobody else was. And then we had the book that we ultimately decided upon, which is a new adventure for us, but it's a graphic novel. And it's a graphic novel called The Best We Could Do by T. Bowie, who is a first-generation American, Vietnamese American, whose family were refugees from Vietnam. And this book, while as a graphic novel, is her first attempt at drawing, but it's a memoir. It really goes into a very nice story about a very difficult time in the history of Southeast Asia and what prompted her family to relocate to the West Coast. And it's not a war story, but the war is certainly part of it. It gives us a lot of opportunities to talk about a lot of different themes. One of the things this country has never really come to grips with was how we got involved in the conflicts in Southeast Asia, the end of the colonial era after World War II, the return of the French to Vietnam, and then eventually how everything fell apart and why it fell apart. So it's a good opportunity for us to explore that. Now, we often pick companion books to be middle and little read books, and we often have to search for another book that might work. Well, unfortunately, T. Bowie has given us the very likely possibilities. The middle read, while it's not by her, she wrote a foreword to it, and it's called I Am Home. And it's first-person accounts by immigrants and teenagers. And they are from school in Berkeley, and it gives us an opportunity to explore from their perspective what is home. Why this may be home, why this country may only be a temporary home, what home ultimately means to them. And it's going to be a great way for us to work with the kids in schools to help define home and use that as a thematic springboard. And then the last book, which is our proposed Little Read book, is called A Different Pond. It is written by, it's not written by T. Bowie, but she illustrated it. And it's, again, a story of a father and a son and discussing issues related to refugees and immigration and stuff like that. So while those topics can be explored, that's not what we're necessarily going to explore fully, but it gives us an opportunity to explore Southeast Asian culture, focusing on Vietnam. It gives us an opportunity to explore home. It gives us all sorts of thematic opportunities. So that's where we're going for next year. And we think it's going to be exciting. You know, every year we think the Big Read is going to be controlled. It gets smaller, and every year it gets out of control and bigger, which is great because it represents enthusiasm. Hopefully this year will be the only year we're dealing with a pandemic, and that we're able to get through this and using science to move us forward and to eventually start doing things again in person. So I want to thank Jewel for all the very hard work that she does every year for the Big Read, and to thank her committee that works also very hard.
I know that we often have handed out the books. We got the list so late, we did not have an opportunity to be able to make a decision, order books, have them for you, and so on. So we don't have books to give away. I'm sorry, but I hope you're going to stick with us, and we'll see you next year.
Will you keep us advised when we can get copies?
Yes.
Yes.
And don't forget, there's books up for sale back there. Thank you all so much. It's been a great Big Read. Woo-hoo!
And thank you all who joined via Zoom.
So I want to finish.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure.
This is like so good for us.
Good.
I'm
I'm
excited.
excited about it.
Such a great day.
Yay, all right.
Thank you so much. Hopefully it's.